Good evening and welcome to today's episode of Liberty Chat, your weekly roundup of all things liberty related and Lib Dems, Liberal Democrats related. I am your host, John Humphreys, National President for the Liberal Democrats, and the panel we have this week is just running through them quickly, and then we'll get to spend much more time with them leisurely. David Limbrick, our lead Senate candidate for Victoria, John Ruddick, our lead Senate candidate for New South Wales, and first time on the show. Welcome everyone. This is a live show. It is on 7:30 every Wednesday. Well, nearly every Wednesday. Apologies for last week. Issues came up. I can't tell you about them. They're very secret. This is the problem with running a live show. So this is live. The questions are coming in. This is streaming to YouTube and Facebook. If you're there, chuck in the questions, the comments. We've got Rob McCarthy slaving away in the background, doing all the hard work so that we can sit here, have beers and have fun. Thank you, Rob, in the back room. But that's enough in terms of an introduction. Let's go around the table and hear what's been happening in the last couple of weeks on the campaign trail and in politics in general in Australia. David, what's happening in Victoria?
Well, I've been doing lots of interviews and media, but one of the cool things that's happened as of today is we have a truck heading around different electorates. I don't know whether Rob can bring up a picture of the truck. There you go. That's the truck with me on it. Liberal Democrats have entered the chat, I think, on nuclear power. So there's been a lot of talk around, these teal candidates and what they're doing with renewable energy and then these carbon zero targets. And then I think we're the only party that's openly talking about nuclear legalization. So, I'm really proud of this policy, and I'm really, as you would know, John, I'm very passionate about energy policy, and it's great to see this truck going around, and hopefully we'll cause some trouble with it.
It really does. The nuclear issue, I mean, there's lots of issues to unpack there, and we all believe in it for its own sake that it should be legalized, but it really does highlight a problem on the, let's call it the alarmist camp, because if you think that there is an existential threat to humanity, and you're unwilling to even consider a viable, fairly cheap, very effective, very efficient form of energy, I don't know how they square that circle. I don't know if you guys have any theories, but it seems to me that you have to take nuclear seriously if you think that there's an existential threat.
I mean, what I've been saying on this topic for a while now is I'm really concerned that Australia is putting ourselves in a position where we're perpetually dependent on Chinese renewables. Everyone says that nuclear is too slow. It's going to take 20 years to build. Well, in 20 years' time, every wind turbine and solar panel in Australia will be waste. They'll all have to be replaced. And we've seen recently with the international situation, especially in Germany, where they've committed to renewables, but they've also required large volumes of gas imported from Russia through pipelines. And they're in a situation where they need this gas to back up their renewables when they're not operating. And they're reconsidering what they've done. They're looking at, was it a good idea to schedule shutdowns of these nuclear plants? And I note that Diablo Canyon in the US, in California, they're also looking at extending the lifespan of that nuclear plant. And I think that, Australia's small role in the whole carbon emissions thing really points to the fact that a lot of these solutions that they're talking about in Australia are really just sending a signal to the world. And my point is that if we're going to send a signal to the world, the strongest signal that we could possibly send is to legalize nuclear.
Indeed. By the way, comments coming in. Marina says, hello, Premier David. So there's a glimpse into your future. Someone else made the comment that the Liberals really did miss an opportunity to make this election about the legalization of nuclear. And I'll just point out that the people who genuinely believe in liberalism haven't missed that opportunity. It's only the illiberal party that missed that opportunity. JR, a topic close to your heart, I know.
Well, look, it's it is such a no-brainer, the nuclear industry, particularly for Australia, because we haven't even been looking for uranium, and we've got the world's largest supply of uranium out of about 200 countries. So why are our political parties so they just sort of don't want to talk about it? Okay. Well, I think it's very clear that behind this whole thing, from Al Gore down, it's about making money. And all these investors are invested in renewables and not nuclear. And it comes down from Davos and everybody else. They don't want to talk about nuclear because they missed that boat. Okay. And it's not as sort of sexy as all this other stuff. Okay. So it is, I want to applaud David. David and Taya Peterson and the New South Wales Liberal Democrats, we've been beating this drum for a long time. It is such a no-brainer. We can be the Saudi Arabia of nuclear energy. There'd be no better country to do it. We don't have earthquakes. We don't have tsunamis. Okay, we've got a ton of vacant space out there, particularly in Ian's state of South Australia. So we've got it's just across the board. And people say it takes 20 years. I was reading a thing the other day saying some of these new nuclear things, I mean, it's all above my pay grade, but someone was making a pretty convincing case. These things can, with enough willpower, they can be in place in sort of 5 to 6 years.
Yeah. Well, more to the point, if it takes 20 years, that's just all the more reason to hurry up and start. I mean, how is that a justification for not starting? Sorry, Ian, this is nuclear uranium. This is all very South Australia relevant. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to Liberty Chat, by the way. But
thank you. You know, I've always wondered why everyone else can use our enriched uranium, but us. And I know here in South Australia that, you know, that debate had been held. And, you know, a lot of people were saying, well, let's give it a go. Let's do it and, you know, become an energy superpower. We all know the South Australian record and history of power. And, you know, we've got some of the highest power prices in the world here, which has had a real impact on business and industry. And there's an opportunity to fix that.
I think one of the things as well that is really special and unique about our policy is how inclusive it is. Many of these debates between political parties talk about, you know, whether or not you believe that climate change, you know, is something that you need to take action on, or whether, you know, you don't believe it. Actually, within our party, we have great diversity of opinion on this, but what we all agree on is the policy going forward. And we agree that the policy is, you know, that we should not favour particular energy types, that we should remove subsidies so that government's not picking winners and losers, but also we should remove prohibitions, artificial prohibitions on other technologies such as nuclear. And I'll note that a lot of these people pushing these renewable technologies, especially the Greens, I love talking about the Greens, the genesis of their party was opposing renewable energy, right? In the Franklin Dam in Tasmania. They also opposed nuclear energy. You know, I struggle to think of an organisation in Australia that's prevented more low carbon energy production than the Australian Greens. But you know, like if you're serious about low carbon energy, then and you're talking about climate emergency, then it seems very strange to totally discount the one technology which has been proven all throughout the world to be able to produce low carbon energy, which is nuclear. And if you don't think that we need to take strong action on, you know, climate change and this sort of thing, then again, you still should be open-minded about these sort of technologies like nuclear energy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, strange is a polite way of putting it. I think it's really an indictment on their inability to follow through on that thought process. JR, were you about to say something? I did want to move on to the next topic, but JR.
Well, look, an important thing that needs to be said about nuclear is that let's say there was a political party that came to government with a 52% majority and they were pro-nuclear. Now, if you were over there in Europe or North America and you were in control of a company that can build these things, you're going to be reluctant to invest if there is political risk. You might win with 52% and pro-nuclear, but the opposition might have been against it. So if you're up there and you're thinking, look, it's going to cost me a couple of $1 billion to invest, how do I know that you know, I'm going to be halfway through this project and there's going to be another government that comes to power? So the only way we're actually going to attract international investors and domestic investors, or people with the skill to do this, is we actually have to have an overwhelming consensus. We actually have to have a bipartisan consensus. Now, look, we've got facts on our side. Let's just keep pushing ahead. Hopefully reality will kick in at some point.
Well, I wanted to move on. I can't let that go because, I mean, what you're talking about there, the political risk premium, firstly, I think I've mentioned this before, but it is a very real thing. And one humorous way to note that it's a real thing is that the stock market goes down in the US, statistically significantly decreases every time Congress is sitting. Just the act of them showing up to Parliament, their Parliament House, whatever it's called, actually depresses the share market because of political risk. Right? So it is a very real thing. I do think there is another potential solution, which is in our Freedom Manifesto, ldp.org.au/freedom. Go and check it out, which is the idea of regulatory compensation, which is to say that if the government passes regulation that destroys your business or undercuts the value of your assets, they owe you compensation for that. And what that does, firstly, is it increases just the fairness of the system. If the government's screwing you over, they should have to pay for that. And secondly, what it does is it gives people the certainty to know that they can make those investments. So we've to some degree, we have tried to address that because it is a very real problem. Even if you legalize it, there's good things to be done out there that may not be done because of political risk premium. And regulatory compensation is perhaps a step towards resolving that. We've done this a little bit. David, in Victoria, anything else going on in your world? We haven't seen you on the show for a while.
Yeah, I haven't been on for a while, but look, we've been doing a lot of campaigning in Victoria. Last weekend, I went out to yet another new branch meeting. This was our South Metro branch meeting in Caulfield. We had many new members turn up. It was great. I've also went out to Warragul recently, which was awesome. There's been lots of things going on. I've done lots of media. I was on Sky last week. I'm going to be on Sky again this Friday night. Did 3 interviews on radio today. Also yesterday, for those of you that have been following me in Victoria, you'll be familiar with the issue around the Frankston murders that happened back in the 90s and stuff, and my campaign on that to ensure that the parole thing that's coming up next year doesn't happen. I went along to an event yesterday, which was very emotional for me and for many others. But I was asked to speak on behalf of one of the victims' families. And I spoke to, many people within the school community and the local community about, what had happened and my memories of the events that had happened and how we need to make sure that this person is not released next year because it's so dangerous a situation. But that was a very unusual thing. I was very upset that the member for Frankston, a Labor state government member, was meant to speak there, and he just didn't show up, which was pretty insulting actually to everyone, including me. But yeah, it's a big issue, and I think it's going to turn into a bigger issue a bit later this year. For those of you that aren't aware, I recently, late last year, I took part in a documentary which is going to be shown on Stan and syndicated globally, and that's going to be released in June. So watch out for that. That's going to come out soon. All
right, that's hard to segue from that topic, but I will take it to quite a boring place. Well, not your fault. That is that, and I know you're out of the Victorian Parliament, David.
That's correct. Yeah, I'm an unemployed citizen at the moment.
You've escaped that.
You're working very hard though, but yeah.
You've left poor Tim Quilty on his own, and I met with Tim and the Victorian Assistant Treasurer recently to have a look through the Victorian state budget. There's not a hell of a lot to report on. One quick factoid I thought was interesting. Budget paper 3 there just outlines all of the new policies. It's 420 pages long, and of all the new spending policies, there was not one negative sign in the document. They used to, when governments released budgets, they used to release savings measures. There were often only a few, but they used to release some savings measures to save some money so they could justify the extra spending measures. 420 pages, not one savings measure in the entire budget. So there would have been hundreds upon hundreds of new policy measures, all of them additional spending. And if the government, I like doing this when I look at a budget, if the government had just managed to control themselves for 1 year, I don't expect politicians to control, except for you three wonderful gentlemen. I don't expect most politicians to be able to control themselves permanently. But if they could just hold on for 1 year, the Victorian Parliament the Victorian budget would actually come back to surplus next year. And instead, they just can't help themselves. So that's my quick little update of the Victorian budget. Let's keep going around the table then. JR, what's been happening in New South Wales, your campaign, and the world of politics?
Well, look, I've been going to a lot of events. I'm going to the Blue Mountains tomorrow. And look, what I have noticed is in the western suburbs, which have been traditionally Labor areas, and where there's a lot of ethnic Australians, and where the lockdowns were very intense, the anecdotal evidence is very strong. Okay, that we're going to go pretty good now. And outside of Sydney, I've been up into the sort of the Hunter Newcastle area half a dozen times in the last few weeks, and there's good crowds there. And there's always UAP people and FON people there. But so look, I'm really enjoying it, getting out there and meeting all these good people. And it's everybody wants to talk about what Brett Sutton said on Channel 7 last week, which I know is a Melbourne thing, but he said, oh, well, we can't work out the difference between COVID and the flu anymore. Okay, so, and then he look, I don't think he was misspeaking. I've watched it a few times. He says, people who are vaccinated can expect to get the flu worse this winter. Okay, so don't quite know what's going on there, but a lot of people are, having their doubts about it. I mean, I am not seeing any difference. A lot of people I know are getting COVID. I am not seeing any difference in terms of how many people get it and the impact it is between vaccinated and unvaccinated. So what we saw is, in the ACT, it's been barely remarked, but there's a Labor chief minister in the ACT. And he has been the best leader in this country about vaccine mandates. They never had really intense mandates. And I think just yesterday or the day before, he said, if you're a teacher and you're unvaxxed, or if you work in healthcare and you are unvaxxed, welcome back at work, 100%. No more questions asked. Now, terrific that they're doing that. Now, we've got Dominic Perrottet, our Premier here in New South Wales, who's meant to be from the conservative/libertarian side of the New South Wales Liberal Party. He just waxes and wanes. It's very blurry what the rules are in New South Wales right now, the biggest state in the Commonwealth. It's very blurry. It's not clear. But I can't see them saying nurses are welcome to come back to work, even if they're unvaxxed. We've got a big teachers' strike in Sydney today. All the public schools are on strike, all they've closed down. And they're saying, oh, there's not enough staff. Well, wonder why that is. Okay? They've sacked all the best ones because they don't want the vax.
Thank you, JR. I thought you were going to find some way to sneak in a reference to Thatcher's anniversary there. But
well, today is a great day because it's May the 4th, so it's Star Wars Day, May the 4th. And it's also the day that in 1979 that the turnaround really began. I was 9 years old, and that's when Margaret Thatcher got elected. And, as far as libertarians go, she was about as good as they get, cutting taxes, deregulating, privatising. And she didn't just fix Britain up after it had been in decades of decline. The Margaret Thatcher principles were so successful that they were adopted across the third world in the late 80s and the 1990s. Privatisation, foreign investment, deregulating the currencies. And what did this do? Not just in China gets a lot of the headlines. Terrific that China did all that stuff. But I'm talking about in a lot of poor countries. In the 1980s, when I was a teenager, I remember being absolutely heartbroken on multiple occasions when you would see on the 6 o'clock news, Africans starving to death as far as the eye could see. That's what started the whole Band-Aid thing and Live Aid thing, right? Because they were Marxists. It wasn't because of drought. It wasn't because they'd run out. It wasn't. It was because of bad politics. Okay. And then the Thatcher Revolution turned Britain around, And then all these countries, I mean, almost all countries in the world introduced to some extent Thatcherism. And you do not, and most people in the West don't understand this. There is basically no famine in Africa today. Okay, there was in Darfur a decade ago, which was caused by a war. Okay, but there is basically no kids walking around with bloated stomachs because they've run out of food. And why is that? Because they've brought in the free market across Africa and South Asia, Latin America, and these are good things. And that whole process began this day in 1979. Thank you, Margaret Thatcher.
There's a lot of love for what you're saying there, and I appreciate how much you appreciate Maggie Thatcher. I'd say there's still starvation in North Korea, and you'll note the consistent theme there. The more seriously you take Marx, the more likely you are to starve some of your population to death. It's very sad that you still go through university and people are taught a positive version of Marx when you look at the world, and it shouldn't be. I got to say, though, in my opinion, JR, I'm going to disagree with you a little bit. Maggie did a great job, but I give a lot of credit to the reforms of the 80s, which Maggie Thatcher did in the UK, Ronald Reagan in the US, Hawke and Keating in Australia, and the Lang and Douglas governments in New Zealand, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think it's a coincidence that people like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek had just got through basically winning the economic argument the decade before that. So I would give them a lot of credit. Falling in the background, I don't think you could have had Thatcher and Reagan without Friedman and Hayek. Whereas as long as you had Friedman and Hayek, someone was going to come in and implement their ideas, because we didn't have a Thatcher in Australia. We ended up getting a Keating. They didn't have Thatcher in New Zealand. They got a Roger Douglas. So as long as someone knew how to read Road to Serfdom and Free to Choose, those countries started trending the right way. Once the problem got bad enough, which I think we're going to touch on in a second, the issue of when the economy's mismanagement gets bad enough, the need for real leadership and sensible economic management that no one else except our party is talking about, unfortunately. But before we get onto that,
I credit Hayek with a lot of that.
Yes, well, I mean, Friedman's my man, so I'm biased. I mean, Friedman conference.
Let me correct both of you. Okay. Oh. The biggest public figure in favour of free market reform in the 1970s was Ayn Rand. Thank you very much. She was the one that was getting the biggest audiences on the Donahue show. She was the biggest public figure. And look, they were all fabulous, no doubt about it. But let's not forget the magnificent Ayn Rand.
Well, okay. It's awkward to choose favourites there. I'm still going to stick with Friedman. And so we got one each here. I think Friedman did more to change minds. I think that was his great virtue. He was so bloody likable and so good at explaining things in a way people hadn't heard it before. And Adam Barnes is saying Rothbard for him. I mean, feel free to chuck your influences up in the chat as we go. Let's come back to the discussion of economic management, because it is something that this country needs a much more serious discussion about, and it's missing in the main campaign going on between the main parties and most of the minor parties for that matter. But before I do that, I want to throw to our latest guest on this show, Ian Markos, our lead Senate candidate for South Australia. Normally I ask what's happening in the campaign, what's happening in your world of politics, but I might start with asking the more blunt question, Ian, for our audience. Who are you?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. Hello, everyone, and it's nice to be on the show, and thanks to John. I was sitting in a pub over on Yorke Peninsula, for those that know the Yorke Peninsula, a couple of weeks ago, and got a phone call from John asking if I'd considered a run. So over the next few days, we both had a couple of chats, and I had a really good think about it. I was in retirement at that stage, and I decided we'd give it a crack. So here I am today. So a bit of background about me. I've been retired for just probably over 12 months. Prior to that, I was the Chief Executive Officer for the Master Builders Association here in South Australia, and I've been in and out of the construction industry most of my life, but prior to that, I was working for a national tier one construction company. Prior to that, I was working in the UK. Based in London, but I was working all around the UK and was working in areas in diving and construction and major hazard facilities. Prior to that, I was had my own business, and I was a commercial diver, so I'd worked right around Australia. Had a stint in the public sector, so I was Director of Construction for Safe Work SA, which is like the equivalent of work cover or, work safe interstate. And so, that's my background. In South Australia, what I'm finding here is that the party's really good. There's a good campaign crew here. It's been nice. They've been very supportive, and they're hungry. So, they're keen to get things happening. I think we've got a pretty good chance. The general mood out there when I'm talking to people is that they've had enough of the Liberal and the Labor Party, but in particular the Liberal Party here in South Australia. The view is that they've been infested by moderates or wets, particularly out of the Christopher Pyne and Birmingham kind of faction. They've lost touch with the real people, and particularly those, what I call those blue-collar working class families out in the suburbs. And that come to bear in the last state election, which was only about a month ago. So
Ian,
there's a...
Sorry for interrupting, but am I right in thinking, from what I can tell from this distance of Queensland, South Australian Liberals seem to be, as you say, inundated with the mods, the wets, the people who accidentally joined the wrong party. But am I also right in thinking that the South Australian Labor Party seems to be run by the last vestige of the Labor right, and maybe the last couple of sane people left in the Labor Party are running the South Australian Labor Party? Is that a fair assessment?
Exactly right. When I was running Master Builders, we had a better relationship, believe it or not, with the Labor Party than we did the Liberal Party. They were more responsive. They'd listen to what the needs of the building industry were. They were more supportive of small business. They would listen with some care, whereas the Libs didn't want to know. We had a premier that was no leader. It was missing in action for the last 2 years. They had a retiring treasurer run their re-election campaign, which was a disaster. But the real feeling here is, standing on pre-polls and that at the last election and just getting out and talking to the business community, is that, they're sick of unelected bureaucrats running the state. And people have realised that, they've lost their representative system of government. With an elected MP, you can go and talk to that person, you can correspond with them, you can let them know what you think or, what they should do. How do you do that with a police commissioner and a health bureaucrat that's barricaded in the Department of Health? You've got no access to them. So in effect, you've lost that representative system of government, and people have had a guts full of it here. And I hope that we can pick up on that and, we get those votes.
This is a very true phenomenon. I think it's been derisively called by some the deep state, but whatever you call it, the idea that more and more power is in the hands of the bureaucrats is an unavoidable conclusion. The politicians come and go. When they get to Canberra or Adelaide or wherever depending on which government you're talking about, the bureaucrats get in their ears. And there's hundreds, thousands of bureaucrats with all the time in the world to do the research and work out the talking points. And the politicians have a very short amount of time, and then they have hundreds of people in their ears all telling them the same marching orders. It's unsurprising that most politicians end up being, led around by the nose by
factions, John, were, really telling them what to do here. But I was amazed at the lack of backbone by a lot of these politicians. They kept extending the emergency powers, and you'd go, I would go and meet with them, talk to them, pick up the phone and call them, and confidentially, they would agree with me, but they never had any courage to do anything about it. And I think a lot of people seen that. And, then we had the two bureaucrats who became kind of like media stars here. And, sure, you'd want to listen to the health advice, but let them get on stage, give the health advice and get the hell off the stage. They're there with the makeover and the inconsistencies and do this and then don't do that the next day. And I think, people just want to be left alone to manage the risks themselves. They've had 2 years of this. They know how to look after themselves and they know how to look after their own family, and they want to take that responsibility themselves.
That word courage, I think, was key there. And not everyone who shows up to politics, perhaps not most of them in the major parties, necessarily come with enough courage to stand up to the bureaucracy. And we might sort of mock them for that. But it's not necessarily that easy a thing to do. You have to come into politics well armed with a philosophy and a set of principles and a determination to stand up to the bureaucrats. And if you don't come well armed with a set of principles already, it's pretty easy to get pushed over by the bureaucrats once you're in there, which is, again, one of the reasons why you need a party of principle, and that's the Liberal Democrats. Of course, I would say that. Cara, by the way, comment coming in while you were speaking, saying, I think spot on, Ian, it's called a technocracy, was the name she had for that. Sorry, I did interrupt you a little bit there. What else has been happening in the world of South Australia and your campaign, Ian?
Well, we had a debate Monday night, function where we were up against some of the other, what you could call the minor freedom parties, which was quite interesting. There was well over 100 people in attendance. Some pretty, good tricky questions at the end of it with Q&A. Again, people want to hear in, plain speak, plain language, what you stand for, what you believe in. But they kept saying, what's your policy on this and what's your policy on that? And, all the candidates would reply to that. And I did say to them, look, policy is very important, but policy can change. So, ask me what my values are. What do I believe in? And you should be asking everybody what their values are. And that started kind of like an audience discussion, which really turned out positive for us because, the values, I guess, collectively that we have are liked generally by, Australian people. And that come across really well. So a lot of people hung around afterwards. They were keen to inquire and talk about the party, which, was a good takeaway.
So, Ian, I understand that you're number one on the ballot paper. How many parties are there contesting the South Australian Senate election?
We got like a Melbourne Cup field, so we got 22, I think it is, John.
Right. Okay. Oh, well. 1 out of 22 is good luck.
Well, I think so. We're number one, and we all went along and waited there, and the marble came out. And when our marble came out, it was fantastic. So there was a few sour faces in the audience, but bad luck for them.
It is quite remarkable. Twice in a row in South Australia now. The first spot for the South Australian state election, first spot now for you, Ian. I appreciate that. The other piece of news coming out of South Australia, I guess, worth noting is in that South Australian state election, of course, we had James Hole at the top of our ticket. 11 people were elected to the South Australian state upper house. After the initial count of the primary votes, James was in 12th. There was held out some hope that preferences might get him over the line. They didn't. So with 11 people elected, he got the 12th most amount of votes. Great effort by James and the campaign team down there. That's a big step forward from last time, and looking forward to another big step forward next time, and hopefully in this election. But congratulations, James. We should have you back on soon.
Definitely something that we're going to build on.
Yeah.
Right.
Excellent. So thanks for that, gents, going around. I did think one of the big issues of the last week, I think, has been consumers have already seen when they buy their groceries, the cost of living is going up. And people say the cost of living is going up. And so we all know it's an issue. My family certainly knows it's an issue. We just bought the exact same thing and the price is significantly different. But now the statistics have finally caught up with us. And the stats are showing inflation at over 5%. And that's inflation measured in a kind of dodgy way. So it looks like inflation is becoming a very real issue in this country. And as it does, it leads directly into interest rate discussions. And we saw, is it yesterday or in recent history anyway, the cash rate, the RBA put the cash rate up from 0.1, a ridiculously low 0.1, up to now 0.35. So it's still a bloody low interest rate. But it does look like we're entering a new era potentially of economic discussion. And it seems like the major parties are singularly unprepared to be able to prosecute this argument in any sensible fashion. It's only 3-word slogans and talking points. And very few people willing to say the difficult things that might need to be said. Gents, any thoughts on that? I'm just throwing that into the ether. Any comments on the downward spiral of inflation and interest rates that we're on today?
I think this is something that we've been speaking about for a while now. The consequences of this massive spending that the government's been doing, and I think there's a lot of policies in our Freedom Manifesto which directly address many of these cost of living concerns that are coming up and inflation. So things like we want to lower fuel excise tax, for example, which feeds into everything, right? Every truck that goes to a supermarket, it gets there with diesel fuel. So if we can lower the cost of that, that lowers the cost of goods being distributed in supermarkets. Also, more money in your pocket, raising the tax-free threshold to $40,000 and having a flat tax rate of 20%. This means there's more money in the pockets of Australians. Our energy policy, making sure that we have energy available in the most reliable and cheapest manner possible. Again, energy feeds into everything inflation. But also the government's got to stop spending like there's no tomorrow. This is totally not sustainable what they've been doing over the last 2 years. They can't pretend that it's sustainable. Seeing the Victorian budget that was released yesterday, they clearly intend on raising the debt even higher and higher. And as I've said a number of times, people have asked me, how do you know when the government, either the state or the federal government, is in trouble? And I think my comment was, when you start seeing ads for government bonds on Facebook, then you'll know we're in serious, deep trouble.
Yeah. JR, I know you're got a keen interest in monetary economics as well.
Well, look, I mean, you just can't go out and tell people to sit at home for months on end, tell businesses to shut down, and we're going to just pump out free money to you all, and you just and not have a serious outbreak of inflation. So, of course, this is not an Australian thing. It's happening all around the world. Okay, and they're trying to blame it on this thing in Ukraine, which might have a little bit of impact. But this is the COVID chickens coming home to roost. And now the worst thing about inflation is that it makes rich people richer and poor people poorer, which was the old Marxist mantra about what's wrong with capitalism. But it's true, because if you own your property, you got no debt on it, doesn't really matter what the inflation does, you still own the property. Okay, but it hurts poor people. This was I know there's some of the viewers on here will have mixed views on President Trump. Let's just talk about his economic policy. His economic policy was a massive cut in company tax, deregulation. He was pro and all above the board energy policy. And what did that do? It triggered economic growth. But it was the best type of economic growth because poor people on low incomes, had the best growth they had had in decades. Under those, I'm not saying Trump was a libertarian, but on economics he was pretty good, and things were going very, very well. Now, and then we've had this COVID madness come along, and now we've got all this freaking out about interest rates. Look, I'm sorry, it's just another hysteria. The interest rates are already way too low. They should never have been crashed when they were 2 years ago, because they were historically at very, very low rates before COVID. And then they decided to crash them basically to zero. And now they've just put them up a little bit. And then now the 6 o'clock news goes out there and interviews somebody and says, oh, it's going to be so bad. Oh, I don't know how I'm going to afford my mortgage. Well, it's all crap. I've been a mortgage broker for 22 years. I've helped close to 10,000 people get a mortgage. So I've been through it once or twice. Everybody that gets a mortgage in this country, historically, up until the last sort of 5 years, let's say interest rates were typically 6%, before the bank approves you, they stress test you. And they say, okay, well, the interest rate today might be 6%, but we want to make sure that if the interest rates are 2.5% higher, so 8.5%, we want to make sure that you could still afford it if it goes to 8.5%. So there was a 2.5% gap between the reality and the stress test. Now, since in the last sort of 3 or 4 years, the stress test, when the interest rates are down at 2%, the stress test, everybody that's got a mortgage in the last few years, the bank has pretended that the stress test has been at 5.5%, okay, or 6%. So everybody now that your mortgage has gone, your interest rate's gone from 2.5% to 2.75%. I'm sorry, when you got approved, you told the bank that you could afford the repayments at 5.5%. So what we need in this country, what we need radically, quickly, to combat the menace of inflation, which hurts poor people more than anything else, is interest rate rises, bold interest rate rises. We need political leadership to come out and say that we need to get back to normal as quickly as possible, or we're going to really stuff our economy for the long term.
Yeah, the difficulty with these issues is the short-term consequence of having low interest rates, because I would agree with you. We've had interest rates that have been too low for too long for responsible economic management, and both sides of politics have happily clapped along to that. The problem with that is that low interest rates in the short run look great. Extra government spending and big deficits in the short run look great. And the attitude is kind of like, oh, well, the long run can look after itself. You know, Keynes once famously said, in the long run, we're all dead. The problem is right now we are living through the long run of the decisions made 10 years ago. And it's starting to kick in. This inflation is starting to kick. And if we don't take action now, you said interest rates need to rise. Here's the thing, interest rates are going to rise. We've got a choice about increasing them now, or preferably last year, but now is as good as we can do without a time machine, and try to get inflation under control now, or we can let inflation get really carried away, and then we have to get really draconian later. There's no magical solution of not facing reality. And the earlier we face reality, the less pain.
Yeah, John, I think there should be some questions around the Reserve Bank on this as well. What have they been doing in the last few years? And they should not be beyond scrutiny as well. The other thing is there's some damaging signs here for the building and construction industry. There's already issues around supply, shortages of materials, increase of costs, and the last thing we need is, particularly for the media or Labor, to put a panic through the community to say, well, this is going to impact on people being able to build houses or affordability or whatever. And I take John's point, they do stress test them and everything, but the power of the media influencing the people out there in the suburbs, what they don't want is for them to say, well, we were thinking of building that house, but we may sit back and wait now.
Yeah, well, it's note the Victorian budget actually underestimated inflation. They suggested 3%, so that's clearly wrong. But even with their estimates, they've predicted interest rates having to go up and the housing market starting to come down. And that was actually in those budget forecasts. So we're going to be in for an interesting economic ride. What worries me, look, that happens sometimes, right? Economies go up and down. What worries me is there is a total lack of real economic leadership from both of the major parties. And no real sense that at some stage you have to tell people things they don't want to hear, like cutting back government spending to get the budget under control. It might not be what voters want to hear. They probably want to hear free handouts, but responsible economic management tells them, I'm sorry, the cupboard's bare. We can't give you more handouts right now. And people might want to hear low interest rates forever. Responsible economic management says that the RBA probably made a mistake. I think you're right, Ian. We're going to have to, people need to look with a more critical eye at some of the decisions the RBA has taken. And they didn't just cut rates to 0.1, they also engaged in quantitative easing, which means buying up the bonds, which basically meant they were printing money to lend it to the government so the government could spend it. And we're starting to see the consequences now. And unless there's a sudden influx of Reagan-esque and Thatcherite kind of shock to reality, the problem is that in the 1970s, we had inflation running at about 10% or over for about a decade, until it sparked people into action. And I hope to God we don't have to get that bad before people snap back into reality and decide that responsible economic management is a better path than tempting forever increasing inflation. It seems like we're all in furious agreement. Daniel Turner suggests we should, instead of declaring all the other emergencies that everyone else declares, maybe we declare an inflation emergency. We're not there yet. Well, I would point out that here's the trick. Same with debt, which we've talked about before. If there was a sudden influx of responsible economic management, these issues are entirely solvable in the short term. They don't have to get worse. If they get worse, it's because of the lack of courage and a lack of leadership of our political class.
Yes.
So we're not over the edge of the cliff yet. This is a fixable problem, but only if we stop playing this Pollyanna scenario of just thinking we can have everything without any responsible decision making. Anyway, I've ranted enough. I'll stop on that one. Gents, what did you think of Labor's housing policy? You will own 60% and you will be happy.
Yeah, I'll talk on that if you want to start anyway. Who would have thought we would have got to a point in this country where we would be talking about the government owning nearly half of your house? And I could see here, because there's no boundaries around this, so it's not limited to first home buyers, and it's not means tested. And what that means is I can just see this as being rorted straight away. So, someone saying, well, honey, let's sell the house and we'll invest that money in an investment stream somewhere and get a good return on it. Then we'll stick our hand up and ask for the government to contribute 40% to a new house for us. And we've also seen the Property Council come out in the last couple of days and say, well, this scheme is so great, we should expand it. So the question I would have here is, how's that going to be paid for? But if you did expand the scheme, that's putting a lot of taxpayers' money at risk. And you don't have to look back in time too far to remember the subprime collapse in America, where, they were lending a lot of money to people to build houses that couldn't afford it, and it drove up housing prices, and then there was a major bust. So there's a lot of questions around this.
And that is a great point about the subprime crisis. In the middle of the Monica Lewinsky thing, when everybody was distracted, the political class was distracted, the Clinton administration got this little thing through, this is about 98, little thing through saying that the banks had to lend money to poor people, okay? They were trying to help ethnic minorities, okay? Always with the best of intentions, these lefties. Okay, so they said, we're going to help, and it got no notice at the time. But what they did is they planted a poison pill that went and blew up 8 years later, and the property market boomed. People will walk into the bank, here's your money, here, go and buy 5 investment properties. Boom, then it blew up, and we are still suffering from the consequences of the US subprime crisis. We all went and got ourselves into so much debt, and that was before stupid COVID.
John, I could tell you one thing. I'm amazed, absolutely stunned, that not one person has said, because up to 30% of the cost to build a new house is on taxes and charges.
Yeah.
I'm amazed that no one has said, instead of, the Albanese being your landlord, how about we reduce the taxes and charges and knock 30% off the value straight away?
I don't disagree with tax cuts ever and anywhere, pretty much. Although I got to say, I think another part of the solution has to be relaxing the restrictions on how land can be used, the land use regulations that just artificially decrease the supply. And if you artificially decrease supply, then it's very obvious what's going to happen next. I've got to say the other thing to note about this, and it's often the long-term incentives. It's what Bastiat said is the difference between a good and a bad economist, basically. What's seen and what's unseen. And what's unseen, one thing that's unseen here is if the government has a 40% stake in a bunch of property, what is their incentive to influence the property market? I mean, they're going to have an ongoing vested interest in trying to, if there's a bubble, they got to keep the bubble inflated. They can't let the prices go back to what they're supposed to be at any point in time. If there's a bubble that's supposed to pop, they can't allow that because they're an equity holder. So that's going to be a dangerous long-term incentive there.
But without...
I've got serious problems with that as well on the same line, John. But it's difficult enough getting into a relationship with a bank, to take out a loan. That what they're proposing here is we get into a 3-way relationship with a bank and the government, and the government's going to own part of your house, and they're going to set up all these weird incentives. And it's typical that the government would choose to invest in property right at the point where interest rates are going up. That it seems like the absolute worst time that you could possibly do that. So, look, I think this is absolutely terrible policy, and it will just prop up and inflate the property market even further and set up these incentives that will ensure that, you know, proper corrections and proper price seeking behavior won't actually happen.
Well, what I have noticed with there's been endless government schemes. Mainly first home buyer schemes. They're always convoluted. There's always this is what I have noticed time and again. Let's say the current property first home buyer scheme is, if you buy for $650,000, you don't pay any stamp duty, and above that you do pay stamp duty. So what always happens, and I always warn my customers, I say, look, if you get a property that's really worth $620, it sort of there's more demand for it, so it gets pushed up to being worth you pay $650 for it. Okay, but then I said the property that's worth $660, okay, so it doesn't get the benefit. Okay, well there's less demand there, and then the developers go and build properties to make them worth $650, but of course they're really probably only worth $600. It totally distorts the market. All these first home buyer schemes and all these Albo's just like taking the cake. This is the biggest crap scheme of all. There is one level of federal government or government intervention, I believe, in the housing market. They should step out everything. I do believe first home buyers shouldn't pay stamp duty, but I think there should be a very high threshold rather than creating a distortion. I think when somebody buys their first home, no problem, no stamp duty. After that, that's a very simple concession. And but the government, it always ends in misery, always when the government gets involved. But they do it because they think it's politically popular.
Yeah, I got to say, any solution that does not address the supply side constraints doesn't seem like it's intended to be a solution to the housing problem. It seems like it's intended to be a solution to a political problem of how to get reelected.
Yes.
So without addressing supply, we're just rearranging who gets the fixed number of houses, which is not a real solution. All right, we've done housing. We've put a nail through that one, if anyone wanted to know the answer. Look, we had a question before, and someone was asking us just what are your criticisms of, they specifically said, of the UAP. I'm not sure why they had a thing against the United Australia policy, United Australia Party, sorry. But it is worthwhile scratching the surface of this. There's been a lot of unity amongst freedom parties, and I think, freedom parties. When we say freedom parties, I think that just means the freedom from the vax mandates. I think, as David would be keen to point out, the other freedom parties don't necessarily believe in freedom on all of the other issues that we may care about. But to be fair, vax mandates are a crucially important part of the political debate for the last couple of years and now. So any party that agrees with us on that and agrees with us on opposing net zero are parties that it's worthwhile walking hand in hand with in this election, I think, and backing each other up. But that doesn't mean we always agree. So this question asking us where we disagree, it might be worthwhile looking into that. And I'll throw that to the table here, because there are some, and I don't mean to be trying to rip down the other minor parties when I say this. We agree on some things, but we disagree on some, and let's be honest about that and talk that through. So, gents, do you want to dive into any of the disagreements that have popped up lately?
Yeah, well, I'll start if you want. It's interesting that, it's still called Pauline Hanson's One Nation for a reason, because she's the captain of the ship and she runs it, and Clive Palmer is the captain of that ship. As much as people may disagree, that's at the end of the day, he's calling the shots. And I know here in South Australia, they don't take too kindly to policy and decisions being made by somebody remotely in Queensland and telling us how to live here in South Australia. So I think at least with this party, we've got a good process on policy formation. There's no king or queen sitting kind of thing at the top. There's a big difference. And when you get what I call an eastern state blowing that comes over here and then starts to tell us how to live, it doesn't go down too well. So there's some of the differences. And I think that particularly, they don't have a really good understanding of some of the challenges that we're facing here in South Australia. We're large geographically, but I still remember when we were the third state. We certainly are not now, but we have unique challenges.
I think you just gave away your age there, Ian. But I got to say, like, linking into the earlier discussion, I don't know if JR or David wants to jump in when I say this, but we were all recognizing before, I think correctly, that interest rates have to go up for responsible economic management, and to do otherwise is to perilously walk down the path of ever rising inflation. And I got to say, this idea of a 3% cap on interest rates from Clive Palmer and his mob, God love them, they're right sometimes. They're not right on that issue. That is
no. This is price ceilings. This is central planning of pricing. If you limit loans to a 3% interest rate without any other changes, well, banks aren't going to lend at that rate, right? Because they won't be able to make any money from it. If you were going to force the RBA to keep rates below a certain level, then you're going to end up with the problems that we were talking about just before. You're going to end up with runaway inflation. So I just don't think that this policy, like this 3% cap on interest rates, is realistic in any sense at all.
Well, the sad part is it is realistic because there has been political control of central banks forcing artificially low interest rates and printing money. The history is littered with examples of runaway inflation in Zimbabwe, in Venezuela, in Argentina, in Weimar Germany, et cetera, et cetera. I hope it doesn't happen, but sadly it can. JR?
You see in some of those countries, and you get a deflationary depression.
I would say, look, I've had a lot to do with the One Nation candidates, the UAP candidates, other parties, IMOP, GAP, and I love them all. I get along terrific with them. I'm sure there'll be a lot of people watching this broadcast tonight who will be thinking of voting for them. But if we had to distill it down to something very simple about what the difference is between our party and the rest of them, is that we are the only party which is actually proposing a significant reduction in government spending. And that's as simple as it is. If it's like a family, if a family's getting themselves into financial difficulty, it's because they're spending too much money. Now, that is what we are saying, and there is no other party out there saying we've got to massively cut government spending. It's tough love, but it is love.
Absolutely. This is the idea of freedom across the board, not just freedom on vax mandates, but freedom for how you spend your money, and just generally a smaller government, not only when it's your niche issue, but also when it's other people's niche issue, generally a smaller government across the board. And that's something that we've believed in consistently based on principle for 21 years, not when a focus group told us it could be useful lately. So, look, we're running out of time now. We're in the last minute. I did want to, I don't know if Rob's still in the background, he can throw this up, but just as a quick round out for the other states that aren't represented here, Queensland had a great campaign launch. I don't think we've got pictures of that, but check out the Campbell Newman or the Lib Dems Queensland Facebook page. That was an excellent campaign launch with great speeches from some wonderful lower house candidates up there in Queensland. They've got a great team that they put together. The WA had a campaign launch where our Lady Liberty, our lead Senate candidate, Kate Fantinel, came out with a wonderful dress, which I think we've got there. Thank you. This is for people who don't know the reference here, this is a riff off AOC's is it Tax the Rich? And you see it here, Tax the Rich on the left, and we've got Kate, Lady Liberty, wearing Tax is Theft. So our version of that. Thank you, Rob. And the other state, it's not here today. You'll see Topher's missing. Topher is doing a bus tour around Tasmania. He has landed. He's done his first couple of events in Hobart. I believe he's now driven up to Launceston and is doing an event right now. That's why he couldn't join us. But he's got an awesome bus. Again, look out for those pictures. If you haven't seen them, go and check on YouTube, Facebook, Insta, any other social media. Go and give him a like, follow what he's doing. And that's the same for everyone here. Gents, any last comments before we head out? David?
Oh, look, we've got lots of stuff planned over the next few weeks. I'm going to be traveling all around regional Victoria. So if you live in around Western Victoria, stay tuned to my Facebook page, and there'll be lots of events I'll be coming to soon, and I look forward to meeting you.
Okay, last comments, JR?
Blue Mountains tomorrow night, Wagga on Friday, Dubbo on Saturday. Really looking forward to it. But what if there's people out there who have got time? We've got pre-poll starting on Monday all around the country.
Yep.
Now, if you've got time just for a couple of hours, please, pre-poll is increasingly important. It's getting close to half of the country is voting pre-poll.
Yeah.
It's not fun, okay? It's boring, okay? But you're going to be helping the country, so please get some how to votes. If you can, encourage other people. The good thing about pre-poll is there's only like 2 or 3 locations in most electorates, so we can cover it off. But please, we need people to say, yes, I'm good for a few hours at pre-poll. Thank you.
We've got down the bottom of the screen, you can see ldp.org.au volunteer. If you can volunteer, please, no matter which state you're in, we can definitely use your help. Ian, last comments.
2 things from us quickly. For those that are watching and listening, please get on my new Facebook, spread it as far and wide as you can. There's some really good content now and messages there, but also volunteer. If you want to kick the Greens out, if you want to see us get in, then please consider helping. And that's putting up a few call flutes if you can do that, letterbox dropping, and as John just said, really consider helping us out on pre-poll and election day. It'll be fantastic. Please try.
And don't believe JR. It's a lot of fun. So take a few friends. If you take a few friends, you'll meet a few friends, and then you can start, winding up the crazy parties if you've got some good wit and banter. You can have fun out there. Go in a pack, and it can be fun. So please do volunteer. If you've got space in your front yard, ask your local campaign manager for some call flutes. Stick up some call flutes in your front yard. Go along to some events. Support your local candidates if you can, and just get in touch with them and ask them if there's anything you can do. There's less than 3 weeks to go. This is an important election. Everyone says that all the time, but I'm saying for our party, right? In terms of having a proper freedom breakthrough, and not just necessarily someone who says the word freedom, but a party that has freedom in its DNA. This is an important election for us. Please get out there, do what you can. That's the end of today. Please join us again next week. These are live chats. They are on at 7:30 every Wednesday, unless they're cancelled, but hopefully 7:30 at every Wednesday. So please come along, follow us on Facebook, on YouTube, ask some questions, join in the chat and the banter, and throw us questions if you like, or just insults. That works as well. At this point, I will ask Rob to put up the little words that we have to say at the end. And after I read this, we're not allowed to say anything else, gents. So this is authorized by John Humphreys for the Liberal Democratic Party, Mount Waverley, Victoria.